This presentation is into the what Vogelin is calling sometimes the Deformation der Wissenschaft, or the Deformation of Wissenschaft, almost the Entartung, or the um, uh, degeneracy of Wissenschaft, which somehow curiously in my analysis uh, is coextensive with the Entzauberung, or the Weberian disenchanted age, which in a certain sense the disenchanted age is the same thing as the deep state, because it's really initially it was understood as a bureaucracy was at one time a neologism, and still often I think if you look at the Hindu, the newspaper, the Hindu, you see the word technocracy being used to mean this, but in a totally positive sense. India, which is, so far as I understand it, vastly more rife with corruption from the standpoint of somebody like Fukyuama than America ever has been. Probably because I suppose they don't really care, because they have different mores. That would be my short take on it. They don't really believe in the standard that they have in formal laws, just as in Russia, the Russian Federation. So in some ways, I believe it can be demonstrated as much more strictly a humanitarian constitution than the American Constitution, which isn't surprising since the 18th century document, which has, of course, been amended several times, but not that many times. If you, as Kennedy puts it, count the Bill of Rights all as one amendment. So the idea of the degeneration of scholarship is simple, and once anybody who's studied Kant or Hegel knows that you can't just understand what they're saying. Your German might be good, but you still won't understand what they're saying, right? Whereas other texts of the same era and today, you could read a page and basically you could give some kind of paraphrase, some kind of relatively good paraphrase, usually immediately. You'll probably get things wrong, but you'll get something. Maybe you'll get the gist wrong too, but it's just, there's less density, less compact technical problems, and quite a few people can understand it readily, whereas almost nobody. I would say no, it would be basically impossible that anybody could. It would be, yes, almost strictly speaking, it would be impossible to understand a page of Kant or Hegel straight out, just because there's a lot of technical vocabulary where you really need to understand the way Kant is understanding the term, or Hegel is understanding. They're not natural language terms. But this is sort of the opposite. The opposite is the leveling into language, which seems to be understood by everyone, but then really isn't. So here's one of the points in Fukyuama is he just levels everything to inner and outer. And I think Dugan, in discussing things with him, has this tendency to some extent, although for him it has a different significance, because he thinks of various spiritual traditions where the inner man, for instance, has a specific meaning, which is certainly not the meaning that Fukuyama is giving it. But that just shows an instance of where, when we just level things down to words that are supposedly immediately understood by everyone, but everybody understands them in their own way. So I'll first try to give an example which has troubled me quite a bit. And we have to set it up by saying this. How so far is it necessary to do what Fukyuama never does, and says, or almost never, and says, look, we really need to understand what Rousseau meant. or whoever the author is, what John Locke meant, or whoever the author is. To have, in other words, Fukyuama totally ignores the classical philologist, totally ignores the question of the best possible forensic case being built up about the correct exegesis of the text, something like that. Exegesis means somebody is a guide in interpreting text, so they don't just literally put down the words. You don't necessarily, because then you end up with I always give this retarded example, which is American colloquial greeting, "What's up?" And then there's a stupid joke, "The sky." So that's just based on the fact that if you go with a literal meaning, you don't get the usage. What's up is just the same thing as how's it going, or it's just a standard greeting. You don't need the literal meaning doesn't matter. It's like just as in in a certain sense, bonjour in French doesn't necessarily translate directly to other languages, just because the practice of kissing on the when that practice was, I think it's still like a lot of people do that, is kissing on the cheeks if it's part of that, and if at a certain level of acquaintanceship, or maybe if there was a amorous relationship and then it ended and then those people meet again, maybe they kiss on the cheeks and things like that, then there'd be things that outsiders wouldn't really know of how this language actually operates in daily usage, French in action version. These simple things, you want the exegete who is a guide and kind of say, this is actually what they mean. It's like, if he's French, then he knows that, and maybe he doesn't, because like if he's French hasn't been in France for 50 years, then he doesn't know the latest practices, right? But it's that kind of thing where you want the real exegete. But Fukyuama, so this is what I'm getting at in this deformation of scholarship issue, is like, if what you're doing is leveling everything down and just saying, this is how I could make sense as a non-student of Rousseau, and then there's this question of, does it become licit because seemingly most people are doing that, or seemingly the way pitted battles in politics are going, they've decided on a interpretation which isn't what Rousseau thought himself. That's sort of a second question. But the first question is basically, it's sort of like, I think it's settled by the essence of liberalism, in the sense that if it doesn't matter about the truth, that if it doesn't matter that we think Rousseau has said, I'm propounding the truth, I made a discovery, and you have to understand me exactly. If that doesn't matter, but what matters rather is the so-called idolatry of facts, as it were, which is first a charge leveled against, I think, Leopold von Ranke, one of the first professional historians. And then later, I think it became much exasperated with the Marxist interpretation, which took over everywhere, and which, although one says customarily something like, there was some theorist of this problem that came out and said, the difference between the chronicle and the historian is that the ideal chronicler is no historian because he never sort of tries to solve problems, because he never makes this Zizek versus Stephen Kotkin on the point of, why did Stalin suddenly out of the blue starting signing long lists with 1,000 names on them of people that needed to be put to death, and who were innocent. Why did Stalin suddenly start doing that? And was there a method to his madness, etc., etc., etc.? And supposedly this type of question then is what subtly raises the historian above the mere amateur chronicler, or a chronicler who merely sort of says in his vernacular style, here's a story, here's this interesting story about Carlito's Way or something. It might make a good movie. But the historian is supposed to be, aside from his idolatry of the facts, aside from his claim, I'm not doing literature, I'm just a good old-fashioned worshiper of the facts. So they have also these other questions are supposed to be in their province. So we have a minor version of philology, which is sort of amateurish, is one of the big problems of these awful idiot historians who have no training in really thinking. But why? Because basically, if we don't say Rousseau was propounding the truth, and we really need to have the best people who can make the best forensic case and make a really strong case and show in a vigorous way, this is what Rousseau was saying. If we have instead people who say, well, when Rousseau was talking about the origin of inequality, what he really meant was there's an inner man and an outer man, and they're in conflict, something like the way supposedly somebody who declares they're LGBTQ in some way is announcing their inner Eigentlichkeit, authentic actual being, as against their outer social being. But first of all, I think there's nothing like that in the tradition. I would go so far as even to say that. There's no distinction like that between inner and out. I don't understand what that even means. There's, it's sort of like a magical transformation of Rousseau. In the tradition, you have a distinction between acting more like an animal, something like that, and acting more like a human being. And then you could get, say in Goethe, you get this notion of the problematic personalities, where one becomes aware there's different versions of the human being. There's Christ, there's Buddha, there's different versions. But what does that mean? What does that have to do with inner and outer? Nothing. But I think Fukyuama just finds this easy, and it's a vernacular word, and you could just throw it on into any discussion, and it doesn't matter. So let me try to demonstrate that a little bit. If you look at the treaty on the origin of, is it called treaty? Is it just called essay? I can't remember. Anyway, Rousseau's second treaty, I think it's called, or it's whatever it's called, on the origin of inequality, as it's translated. What does it actually describe? So remember, before any theory of evolution, he's talking about these orangutans, which are supposedly, according to him, the natural man, the man prior to civilization. And he's at the same time saying these simpletons in former time, like Locke and like Hobbes, they've talked about natural man, but of course Locke and Hobbes were in the awareness of things like state of grace, state of nature, and it's a whole different awareness. And Rousseau I think Rousseau doesn't know that. I've got in sort of trouble in a silly way lately making these broad accusations very frivolously, like again saying Nick Land doesn't know about Nietzsche, which is even the most precursory sort of web search of him shows that he does know. He has studied Nietzsche quite a bit, but in this case, I think I'm more justified. Probably Rousseau didn't have an adequate understanding of his forerunners, of the way Locke was decisively influenced by Wissant and by Descartes. Or at least Rousseau was, when did Wissant come in? Well, at least by Descartes we could say with certainty. I think also by Wissant, because Wissant had written, what he was so undermining is what he wrote is this thing called something like the I can't remember the title, but the content was all the different versions of Protestantism, which had already risen after just like 1 century after Luther, and which was basically a demonstration of that you need a Catholic Church, because if you don't have a Catholic Church, then you go into chaos just on their interpretations. And Locke was aware of that, so that was partially behind the move to Descartes. Okay, there's partially a motivation to say, if we derive things instead of from this discussion into people saying, I'm propounding the truth, I've spent my whole life looking for it. Like, remember, Newton had said, somebody asked Newton, how do you produce your famous text propounding your calculus? And he said, well, for the last 30 years, I've done nothing but think on that subject. Sit and ponder it. So this type of attitude, of course, with publish or perish, with the thing in the University of Paris where there's a list and everybody has, look at the list. And this sort of urge to sell things, to become a Zizek or whatever, to sell the entertaining things. And then thereby to become the head of research institutes and not have to teach. This type of thing didn't exist for Hobbes or for Locke, but nonetheless, or only in this sense. Only in the sense that it's analogous or homologous with the rise of Protestantism and the large number of theologies which communities organize themselves around are sort of the ground that evolves into this situation of the so-called technological essence, which partially gets its name from Newton, from the transformation of the notion of dunamis and energia from the Aristotelian significances to the modern physics. And then you have to try to solve everything on the basis of the senses, and to say there's nothing in the human understanding that doesn't come from the senses. I think, again, there's another less significant example of this type of problem in Pinker's Blank Slate book, where he doesn't. I don't think I'm making a frivolous accusation on this thing, because I came to this opinion a long time ago when it was more strict about these things, I suppose. Now I've seen them so many times, I'm more inclined to convict immediately, I guess. But at that time, I think I looked at it fairly closely, and I concluded that Steven Pinker doesn't have the slightest idea of what Locke was talking about. Because this is, one superficial sign of that is that he claims, Locke was partially right, blah, 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 because we're born with... But then he goes on to describe, that people have some moral tendencies that come in through commands of the genes, basically, through evolution, which means exactly what Locke meant by the blank slate, which is everything comes in through the senses. It does it through evolution in that case, not immediately. So he misses the whole metaphysical transformation there. So that's what I'm saying with, partially that's a problem with Fukyuama, when he reduces everything and says, here's the standard thing that we all memorized, and since everybody that I come into contact with in conferences when I'm giving speeches, except the people in the audience who object, but they're nutcases, that we all use the same language. So then you have a problem where you get a fake version of almost everybody, there's a generic version that the professoriate can use. And it says, okay, what we should focus on in the essay on the origin of inequality of Rousseau's is this thing that he thinks people are inherently nice, or something like that. And it totally ignores the actual content. The actual content of the essay is one, that he's distinguishing himself from the other people that have claimed to talk about state of nature by talking about a more biological realm. And two, what he describes by happiness is exactly a sort of not being aware that you even exist. So it's something pointing in the direction, if we're philologically correct, we have to say it's very slightly different, but it's still kind of hones, it's still some help, I think, to make the metonymy here, to make the complex transfer of meaning here, is with Nietzsche's statement that in former times pain hurt less. So that's not a subjective statement, it's a direct statement. It's exactly what's behind when we say it's okay to slaughter animals. In former times, pain hurt less. So he's basically saying, if you look at the state of nature of the primitives, one, they have a remarkable, they don't care about life and death. They're remarkably indifferent to death. And I think I've even observed that. I mentioned it recently in the, there was a documentary about some cannibals, I think in South America. I'm not actually sure of the location, but I do remember that they poked one of them, sort of elbow poked the other in the rib, literally, and then they laughed gingerly over having murdered and consumed one of their neighbors in their village. So I think this sort of blithe attitude towards death, which has nothing, it's not like they're enjoying it or saying, look how powerful we are, or ha ha ha, we survived and he's dead or something. No, it's just they're indifferent. They're remarkably indifferent to life and death. And I think this is the happiness at bottom that Rousseau is sort of pointing us to as the natural state. This is totally, what does that have to do with inner? It has nothing to do with inner versus outer. So I think this is a proof that, yes, we're missing a lot when we just do this analysis. Now, let's try to make the case the other way. So let's do a disputation style. Like, what difference could it possibly make? What Rousseau actually thought, if in the political struggle people have as their, like, let's say mens rea, as have their behind their agenda, the Fukyuama understanding. Yeah, well, some people, I guess, sensu stricto, only Fukyuama himself do probably act according to that understanding. Maybe not even Fukyuama himself. Maybe he would have to say, well, here's the model. You can't judge me. I might slip up sometimes, judged by the model. And maybe there's no human being that actually lives up to the model that he's presenting of the end of history. But they probably approximate to it, and maybe we should take seriously the language one uses in daily politics, and maybe one could never do popular politics, democratic politics, the politics aimed at hoi polloi, with anything other than these vague and leveled down and useless terms which don't actually point us to the things they're meant to point out, such as the inner-outer distinction, when what we were really meant to think about is the fact that a primitive existence is almost like a dream or something like that. What's that wonderful film about the green ants, the place where the green ants dance or something like that? The film by the Fitzcarraldo guy, Herzog. I think a Herzog is a duke or something like that. But in any case, I think there's a lot of problems there. And then let me just tag on one more thing to on Rousseau, because it's sort of a like character, and it also kind of affects direct politics. There's this question to me, I never understand it, and it's not totally clear, as philological questions often are. It seems like they will merely be forced to be happy, which sort of means a reclaiming of a Heimat in Hegel's, of a state where you're not really aware of anything negative and therefore you're happy. Something like that, something on a higher level, recapitulate. I mean, like through the Hegelian synthesis, but only one move. Well, I guess it's not really a Hegelian synthesis, but just through the thesis-antithesis synthesis, you start with sort of the negative state of the sweetness of mere being, and then you pass through the problematic state of modern existence, and then you return at a higher level. You return at a higher level to this sort of this sweetness of perfected being, not mere being anymore, but of perfected being at a higher level. That's something like that is what he's showing. There's nothing about inner outer there. And to reiterate again, but there's sort of an amor version towards the agathon rather than a mere friendship version, rather than a mere sort of Lockean friendship version. There's an amor version. There's some kind of, but in the inner outer Descartes version, yeah, it's more like lukewarm, right? It's like, okay, well, you could be in that matrix. It's the matrix situation thing. So it's like, even if you're happy, then you'd have to wonder if it was genuine happiness, something like that. Or whether the happiness was doing to selling out or something like that. Because there's the subjective and the objective. And in fact, it's, I mean, it's a rigged thing in that the objective is understood as the world of physics, or the extended substance, and therefore it doesn't contain human virta or human worth. There's a book on the tyranny of values or virta by Carl Schmitt, which goes into that the term specifically, the virta, I think it is, for worth, for human worth, as against vert, as in Wirtschaft or economy, it's switched out. So like in the liberal version, you get only vert or value, stores of value, by the Modigliani painting. See, that's a problem with, I don't know, I guess, I don't think you could use a film as a store of value very much, because it's not like a painting where it's a one-time purchase like that. It's more like its value is because people are buying tickets or renting it or whatever. It's hard to use something like a film as a store of value. Therefore, yeah, films aren't valuable in the way paintings are, right? But anyway, store of value. Sorry, that was kind of a side parenthetical, because I'm trying to work out some economic thinking too, as one could see in some of the earlier videos. But in any case, I think, yeah, Rousseau is misunderstood probably on the question of what he means by the general will. How is it, volonté generale or something like that? But in any case, I think what this means, but the force that you will immediately be forced to be free, what it means is something almost like the, Friedrich de Grosse, but obey. But instead, he doesn't say, yeah, it means the but obey in a way, but it's almost like it's stronger. It's like you're gonna, become one of us. You're gonna go over to the other culture, because we'll be the dominant culture, and then you're gonna be pushed into the thing. But the idea is that I think the way he's interpreted is as though he's just saying, oh, the dominant culture, whatever it is better. But what he's saying is this, it's same what Kant brought out of it, I think, in a sort of Entwicklung, Fähigkeit, that's the right word for the capacity to develop being, sort of its puissant energies being sort of mind, And then Kant spells out what Rousseau is already saying, right? So Kant spells out that this means, the general will has to coincide with the truth, I think, is what Kant brings out. And that's what Rousseau's saying too. So he's sort of saying if there were a perfect society, but then there were these sort of, there's Russia over there, they're not conforming to the rules-based order. And maybe even some people start to begin to suspect the Hindus don't really even pay any attention to the fact that they're supposedly under the rules-based order. And not to speak of the neo-Mameluke states, which are just fascist states that the America sort of, it's almost like I saw a movie, I think it was with, who's the guy in the, not Matt Damon, but the other one, he had a movie where, I think they were robbers, and then they had this, like, automatic weapons and stuff, and then a police officer sees them, and he deliberately totally turns his head to the other side, to the left, and it's sort of like, I don't see you. It's like, so the police officer just didn't want to go to war with a bunch of guys with the machine guns. They just pretended not to see. I think Kant. Kant just gives a more clarified treatment of that idea, but this is already in Rousseau. I think it's just drawn out. And you could thrust that over the world situation. Say, the premises, it's not that the have a very, I think the actual premises, I think their simple argument is, there's 150 million deaths between World War I and World War II. There must be rules-based order. It doesn't matter. In other words, there must be policing force over the earth, and it must be ours. And then the positive side of it is join the club. Come hang out at Davos, join the club. Or at as Trump wants it in D.C., because we're bringing all the AI to D.C. instead of the Council of Basel or whatever. So the question. So let's just clarify the questions one more time as a bookend. What's the convergence here of the traditional way of doing it and the truth, so the philological way and a claim to promulgate the truth from the view of there's basically just actions, and behind the actions there's some sort of quasi-motives, but probably nobody understands why they're there or why they're voting for this person. They just all understand the same slogans differently, or it was just that they wanted to be part of a community or something, and it wasn't really that. Most cases you have apparatchiks, you have lockstep apparatchiks, signal goes out, this is the enemy of the party, etc., and their whole not just their livelihoods, but their direct identities are based on that. But in any case, we have different types of analysis at war here, and then we have people like Fukyuama who it's as though he's made a specific selection in how things should be presented according to his understanding, and then just thrust it on everyone without. There's something wrong with that, because it deludes a lot of people into thinking, he's giving us the most realistic account, because that's an account that's more, the professoriate is more into it at the moment. Whereas, so it's curious. So one thing, I just got one last example, I keep going on, but in the parts of Locke that are studied, the two treatises on government, and the other parts of Locke that are studied on essay on human understanding, you get nothing on these fine theological problems, which are sort of suppressed. Like if you look at the full works in the disputations or essays, then you get these questions like anyone in the political order must not just affirm God, but also God according to having specific qualities. And he even says different things. At one time he says they just need to affirm God, and then later he says they need these two criteria. But things like that, which are simply not, nobody studies that anymore. That's what I was trying to get, say, in a previous video where I should have made the necessary long-winded explanation that yes, there's some of his treatises that are commonly read, about 3 of them, or two of them are even only supposed, I guess, technically called that way, the first and second treatise on government or governance, and then one other. But in his total writings are much larger than that, and they contain all the debates that were happening at the time, many of which are considered unimportant. But if we're to judge Locke as promulgating the truth, then we kind of have to know about that. If we don't care about that project, then different questions of what we need to know comes up, and that brings us into a sort of chaos, which is only sort of checked by the fact of the power of the universities, because they create a sort of a unified discourse, a unified version of all and sundry, which, although it often is always ready to cede to somebody claiming to be a real expert in some respects, usually is not quite willing to cede in dropping the usage.